Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful. Assalamu alaikum. Alaikum salam. Salam, shalom, peace, namaste, sat sri akal, Allah abha, aum nam. We welcome everyone, dear brothers and sisters, to the All Dulles Area Muslim Society. We are truly honored to have Dr. Karen Armstrong, international scholar, bridge builder, and inshallah Imam Majid will be introducing her. We truly appreciate her leadership and her dedication and commitment to compassion and interfaith dialogue and harmony. And we would look forward to this discussion. We truly appreciate the Adams community and the interfaith community. I know we have members of the Christian, Jewish, Baha'i, and other faith communities with us today, and we're honored by your partnership and continued friendship and journey in working together as Americans and citizens of this country, as well as stewards of this earth, working together to build bridges of peace, respect, harmony, love, and compassion. So with that, we welcome you here today. We look forward to this, and I'm going to introduce Imam Muhammad Majid. He's the Executive Director of the All Dulles Area Muslim Society and the President of the Islamic Society of North America. We appreciate his leadership and dedication to community work and interfaith harmony, and he will introduce Dr. Karen Armstrong, and we look forward to the session. And again, the topic of the session is Scapegoat. Is religion inherently violent? As Muslims, we condemn terrorism, we condemn extremism, we reject violence, and we want to work for peace. And it's something where people of all faiths reject violence and want to work for peace. And it is an important topic that we must continue to reflect upon. Is it political or is it religious? What is the inherent reasons behind violence in the name, quote unquote, in the name of God, in a sense? So we look forward to this discussion. Thank you so much for joining us, and I give you now Imam Muhammad Majid.
I would like to say that it's a great pleasure to introduce a great author, a great writer, inspired millions of people around the world, have transformed many people, and her latest book, 12 Steps to Compassion, have transformed people and changed their life, and the issue of compassion now become a global movement, from Pakistan to Indonesia to Washington, D.C., and will be in Senegal. We'll be discussing that in March. And therefore, I was telling her that sharing with her coming back from the hotel, that how much change she brought to this world by just writing that book. She wrote many books that impact many people's lives, but this book really, as a rabbi told me, that it could be the manifesto, it could be a turning point in the history of the world today if we were to apply these principles of compassion. Therefore, I'm very grateful to her that she made time to speak to the community. She was speaking to people in academia and joining them in their academically and called the ivory tower. But she believed that all the ideas has to be brought down to the grassroots where the change takes place. So I'm very grateful to have her to speak to us today. She's a friend of this community. She's been here many times. And therefore, we're thinking about having her to live across the street. We try to convince her to do so. Maybe take her to real estate tour in the area so that she can see that, Virginia is good as London also. Here she is.
Thank you.
Thank you, Imam. It's always a great pleasure to be with you. Okay? That's easier said than it's always a great pleasure to be here. Imam Majid's doing so much work here with his colleagues to make compassion a vibrant and dynamic force in our polarized world. One of the reasons why I asked to Ted, who gave me this prize, to help me launch the Charter for Compassion, was that I'm convinced that unless now we learn to treat all peoples as we would wish to be treated ourselves, the world is not going to be a viable place. We are closely united, electronically, financially, politically, economically, and yet we still tend to put ourselves in a separate privileged category. Now, the challenge of our time is to create a global community where people of all persuasions can live together in mutual respect. And there is nothing more important. Every one of the world faiths has developed its own version of what's sometimes called the golden rule. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. Telling you to look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstance whatsoever to inflict that pain on anybody else. Now, Confucius said you have to do it all day and every day. In England, we have a habit of saying, well, we've done something nice for somebody. Well, that's my good deed for the day. As though you can then return for the next 23 hours to your usual selfishness and unkindness. But no, all day and every day. And this is the challenge for our time, to translate this into practical terms that guides our politics, to create a fairer, juster world, because the stakes are high. But of course, there's a downside to this. Because of my profession, wherever I go in the world, people say to me, they come out with a sentence: religion has been the cause of all the major wars in history. I've heard it every time I jump into a London taxi, and the driver asks me what I do for a living. When I say I'm a historian of religion, out comes this sentence. But I've heard it in America from academics, I've heard it from politicians, I've heard it in all parts of the world. It's a very strange idea, because we all know that the 2 world wars of the last century were not caused by religion, they were caused by nationalism. Hiroshima, the dropping of that bomb on Hiroshima was not caused by religion. It was caused by, to end a national war. The historians tell us that people never go to war for a single motive, and that the most common motive for warfare is what they call the competition for scarce resources, for food, oil, land, money. So why is it that we persist in this? Well, I think it's a complicated story, and you're happy. This is the first time I'm speaking about this book. I only finished it 10 days ago. It's now. Thank you. It's now with the publisher. I haven't got a title for it yet, but the book is written. And it is looking at this, and I'm taking the story. It's a narrative, a story from ancient Mesopotamia, when civilization first comes into existence, to Al-Qaeda and our present problems. And one of the problems that we have when we talk about this is that in the West, we've created a very peculiar way of thinking about something we call religion. We think of it as a set of doctrines or standard beliefs and ethical and ritual practices in an organized way, separate from all other activities of life. That has been the way we've talked about religion since the 17th century. And in the West, that was part of the way we modernized. But no other culture has any conception of religion like that at all. Deen, for example, doesn't mean something separate from the rest of life. It means a whole way of life. Dharma, too, the same. There's no word in either Greek or Latin that corresponds to our word religion. In the Middle Ages, the word religio referred to a monk. And it was distinguished, the monk, from a priest who lived in the world. The Latin word for the world was the seculum. So that's where we get our word secular. But both were holy men of God. Just one worked in the world and one worked in the monastery. But there was no conception. Religion permeated all activities of life. If I would, the phrase I use to make clear this is rather difficult to say this in the Adam Center, but to try and extract religion from the rest of life is like trying to take the gin out of a cocktail. Something that you wouldn't know anything about here, many of you, but it's as difficult as that. It permeated everything. No state ideology before the modern period was unreligious. Religion permeated politics. It was unthinkable that it made no sense. And I think in many parts of the world it still makes no sense to keep religion out of politics. Think of the Quran, which calls upon Muslims to create a just and decent society where people of all ethnicities can live together in peace. This is a political act. You have to work politically for justice and equity. That is how you become a true Muslim, and it is in the effort, the jihad, the struggle to achieve that, which means putting your selfishness to one side and looking after the poor in your community, looking after the vulnerable, that you achieve that act of Islam, of surrender of the ego to God. But we are a violent species, however. We would not have survived in the longest period of our history, in the Stone Age period, if we had not become professional killers. We had to kill animals in order to survive. Before we invented agriculture, we were entirely dependent for some 20,000 years on the eating and killing of animals. And yet, from the very start, people were disturbed about this violence because we find it today with indigenous peoples that they feel very close to the animals who are their patrons. And they are disturbed. In the Kalahari Desert, where there's very little wood, the bushmen there have only very light weapons. So they use, when they go hunting, they can only use a very light arrow, which they douse with poison, that kills the animal very, very slowly. But then the man who has killed the beast has to sit with it while it dies, crying when it cries out, groaning when it grows out, identifying with the prey, and realizing what it is we do when we take life. So from the first, there was that sense that killing is wrong, and yet we are driven to do it. To survive, they had to do it. In the British Museum, we have one of the oldest objects in a museum in the world. It's I think it was 11,000 BCE. This was carved by someone in France. It's carved from the tusk of a mammoth. And it depicts two reindeer swimming together, one on top of the other. And he's got that, it's done with such tenderness and love. And yet reindeer were their chief, in this part of the world, reindeer was their staple diet. So here is a man looking with love at these creatures that he is obliged to kill. Now, the same applies, the same difficulty applies with civilization. Civilization began about 3,500 BCE. First of all, in what's now Iraq, in Mesopotamia. The first cities were built. Now, civilization, in which we all live now, was inherently violent. It had to be. The only way that these cities could be built, and this applied to every single civilization before the modern period, which they all depended on agriculture. Agriculture was the chief it was the chief basis of the economy. And what they had to do was they had to take the peasants. The peasants would be forced to give up most of their crop to a small aristocracy. The peasants were kept at basic subsistence level, just enough to eat. They were little more than slaves. 90% of the population worked to secure the freedom and leisure of a privileged class that created the arts and sciences on which our civilization depended. And from the first, again, there was profound uneasiness about this. You see in the early Mesopotamian myths a real sense of distress and facing up to this fundamental injustice of human society. And that's what we have to deal with now. That we are the recipients of this iniquitous system. Whether every single civilization that developed, whether it was in Mesopotamia, in the Middle East, in India, in Africa, in Europe, depended upon the subjugation of at least 90% of the population. In the 17th century, we changed that because in the West we created a new kind of society based not on agriculture anymore, but on technology and science, and the technological replication of resources, and the constant reinvestment of capital. But I'm still not sure that it's an entirely just world. There's still a huge gap in all our countries between rich and poor, which is growing. And there are some parts of the world which doesn't even have clean water, while some of us are living in the lives of kings or princes. So there is a dilemma to civilization. We need to live in states, and the state is an essentially violent institution. There's a, I wanted at one point to call my book Ashoka's Dilemma. But I knew the publishers wouldn't let me have it because most people haven't heard of Ashoka, so they would, and, you know, you have to have, the title is very important when you're writing a book in order to sell it, so you have to take the publisher's advice. But Ashoka was an emperor of India, the first emperor to govern almost the whole of India in about the 3rd century BCE. And where did that come in? The sky.
It is white peace.
Exactly. Ashoka, he'd come to power. He was no stranger to violence, but he came to power. He came to power only by killing 2 of his brothers who stood in front of him. The states are violent. And he had a reputation for immorality and cruelty. Then one day he accompanied the army to Kalinga in modern Orissa to put down a rebellious city that was rebelling against imperial rule. And he experienced a profound conversion. He wrote his thoughts on a massive inscription as high as this room, saying that how appalled he was by the killing, telling all kings that if they had to fight to keep casualties to a minimum, that it was important to revere all teachers, that people must live in peace, and that violence was not the way. It grieved him. It grieved him to see all the prisoners of war being taken away to work on the land elsewhere, to go into slavery, basically. It grieved him to see the suffering inflicted on their families. And he put up these inscriptions throughout his empire. They were uncovered in the 1950s. And they are remarkable documents. Most kings, when they put up these inscriptions, were telling you how many people they killed with great glee and enthusiasm. But no, throughout he's saying, you must live by what he called a dhamma, a basic rule of life, in which you must be kind to animals, you must be kind to the poor, there must be absolute respect for the for all teachers of all schools. There must be no religious division. He's going to build hospitals for the poor and plant shade trees to give refreshment to anybody to sit out of the sun. But these extraordinary, from one end of India to the other, these extraordinary calls for compassion of Buddha. But he could never disband his army, because he knew that if he disbanded his army, there would just be another fight for power. There would be more killing. The only way to create strong rule was to keep people aggressive princelings and barons, to keep them down under, to stop them fighting one another and creating more havoc, more violence on the poor. No state in history has been able to disband its army. However peaceful and loving it is, or the United presidents often say that Americans are a peace-loving people, but you've got a massive military, and there's no thought of giving it up, because unfortunately the dilemma of our life is that peace depends on suppression and warfare. So that is, in a sense, the dilemma that we live in. Now, however, it doesn't mean that we just have to give up and say, well, there's nothing we can do. But Ashoka did what he could in keeping that idea before people. He was very influenced by the Buddhists, and he eventually became a lay Buddhist. And the Buddha created an alternative to the state in his monastic community, which he called the Sangha. And it was it modeled a different way of people living together. Instead of being based, there was to be no violence in the community. No one could even speak a cross word or make an irritable gesture. The monks would achieve enlightenment by living together in community and peace with one another. Now that may sound easy, but I can tell you I have lived in a religious community, and it's anything but easy. You're living with people whom you haven't chosen, who have all kinds of irritating characteristics that can get up on your nerves when you're living with them, cheek by jowl, day by day. And there are people you like more than others, but you have to overcome those by daily, hourly existence. You learn to overcome those impulses to violence and selfishness and egotism. And this, he said, was the way to achieve compassion. And therefore to achieve the enlightenment that he called nibbana, which means the extinguishment of ego, giving up of ego. Now, a king, one of his patrons was a great king, King Pasenadi, and he said he loved coming to visit the Sangha, because when he went to visit other monks and ascetics, they all looked half-starved and miserable and cross. He said, but here, he said, they all look so happy and peaceful, and I see them living together, mixing together as easily as milk and water, and looking at one another with the eyes of wild deer, with gentleness, modeling another kind of community for people to live together. He said, the king said, it's all very different at my royal court, he said. Here, everyone is jockeying for power, everybody's fighting with one another. Even when I'm speaking, they'll heckle me and challenge me. But here, when the Buddha speaks, everybody listens, quietly, gently. And the Buddhists were not just locking themselves away. The Buddha said you achieve enlightenment by living morally, and to live morally is to live for other people. So when they were not doing yoga, the Sangha would always be at the edge of the town so that they were accessible to all the people who wanted to come and visit and talk. And they did come. That people were drawn powerfully towards the Buddhists because we recognize compassion, a more gentle way of living, as a way that is attractive and appealing to us. And I think the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was creating something of the same in the Ummah that he created in Mecca. In Mecca at this time, in his day, they were building a market economy. And it was like any market economy, any early capitalist economy. Some people were getting rich and some people were going to the wall. There was inequality. People had forgotten the old ideals of the tribe when they lived in the desert. And you had to look after the whole tribe, but every member of your tribe there, or the tribe would not survive. But people were forgetting that, and there was a stampede for wealth, and there was selfishness and a concern for money. Well, you know what it's like. I mean, think of Wall Street or the City of London, and our commercial interest. We're always being told to spend money on things we don't necessarily need to keep the economy going, and we're driven very much by money in our marketly oriented society. Now you have the Quran house, and the Ummah, the community that is created within Mecca, is one where members help one another out, where everyone is equal. It's modeling another way of being human, another way of living together. It's call for prayer. We've just had prayers here. And instead of marching around proudly like the rich, very rich Meccans, sort of pushing up, the Quran describes them strutting around and talking in loud, braying voices, and very self-importantly, the Muslims bow to the ground in humility. In a way that was very hard for Arabs at that time, because the Arabs had never liked the idea of kingship and found it very degrading to grovel on the ground like a slave. But this posture of the body showed them what was to get rid of this prancing, preening ego that draws attention to yourself. And it teaches the body at a level deeper than the rational what is required in Islam, the surrender of the ego to God. And almsgiving, to give alms as a regular part of your life, to look after the poorer people in community, instead of hoarding your wealth to create a private fortune, to give some bit away, to make sure that everybody is equal and that nobody's. It's a model of another way of being human. But then, of course, the problem comes when the Muslims become powerful and they have to create an empire themselves. And they have no option. It was the only way to live in a civilization in that day. But the interesting thing about Muslim civilization, early Islam, is that the Muslims didn't just sit back and say, oh, well, there it is, nothing can be done. They agonized about this, and they created various ways of dealing with it, like the Shia came from that, saying, okay, this aristocratic state with divisions of wealth and poor this has nothing to do with the Quran, the equal idea. We will model a different model. Sufism also began perhaps as a reaction against the luxury of the royal court. Sharia law began too as a countercultural movement against the aristocratic ethos of the court. So people are again trying to create that alternative. And I think you have it too when Jesus was preaching. He was preaching at a time when Palestine was under Roman occupation. And there was great hardship, especially among the poorer people with the harsh taxation system. And he created what he called the kingdom of God. He said, live as if the kingdom of God were already among you. And that means that you live gently and kindly and compassionately, giving what you have to the poor. The Lord's Prayer is very much a prayer of a poor community. Give us this day our daily bread. Just give us enough for today, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive those who are indebted to us. So constantly people throughout history have tried to create an alternative. That's what we need to do today, to create a dynamic alternative against the aggression of so much of our world that is almost inherent in the way we live together in a state. Now, what happened in the modern period? When Europe began to create this different kind of empire, a different kind of economy, based, as I said, on capitalism, and that freed up the Europeans from many of the constraints of an agricultural civilization, because there was always a limit. Beyond, you could only grow so many crops, and then the economy had hit a ceiling. It couldn't go any further. And we thought in those days that we had unlimited resources. We're now finding that's not true, of course. But nevertheless, it was exciting, and it made us, the Europeans, and then the Americans, very powerful indeed. And in the course of this, they created the nation state in order to produce. Once you have an industrialized society, you have to get the peasants out of the fields and bring them into the towns to work in the factories. And you have to have a mass market. People have got to buy all these goods that you're churning out of the factories in order to keep the economy going. So the peasants have got to be paid a certain amount. And various things happen. Democracy comes from the fact that people had to be educated to take part in the production process. But one of the things we did was create the nation state, so that before it had been impossible for people to create a unified nation. There weren't the communications. But the downside of the nation state is that it gives great prominence to the nation, the people, to the ethnic component of the nation. And that means that one of the limitations of the nation state is that it has never been able to absorb minorities easily. And I found in my book that actually the persecution of minorities in the nation state has replaced the persecution of heretics, religious deviants, in the pre-modern state. And these heretics were usually persecuted for political reasons, because they were disrupting of the social order. And that's one of the things the nation state has been incredibly violent. If we think of the world wars, and this is something that I think we have to take very seriously. During the First World War, there was terrible loss of life. You'll remember the appalling loss of life in the trenches. But only 5% of the people who died in World War I were civilians. Only 5% of civilians died. By World War II, 66% of the people who died in World War II were civilians. Men, women, children included. the Allied scientists sat together and carefully worked out how to kill as many people as possible by creating bombs and firestorms so they could firebomb cities throughout Germany and Japan. And someone told me the other day that Hiroshima was targeted because it was one of the few cities that hadn't been destroyed by firebomb. 66% of this is an unacceptable scenario. We deplore terrorists when they kill civilians, but we have now, today, in the 21st century, that statistic has gone up to 90%. 90% of the people who die in today's wars are civilians. And this, I think, is something we are right to honor our troops when they come home, and to mourn those who are killed in combat. But we never hear about these casualties. And this is something that we have to take into account. But this is not done for religion. And I call my book, the publishers aren't going to accept this title, but I call my talk today Scapegoat. In the Hebrew, in ancient Israel, at the time of the Hebrew Bible, every year on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would bring 2 goats into the temple. And one he would sacrifice to atone for the sins of the people. And the other goat would be taken out into the desert. He would lay all the sins of the community onto that goat animal and send it out into the desert. And in that way, the community was purged of its sins. It seems to me that today, I'm not saying that religious people are not violent at all, obviously, we know they are. And we're, as I said at the beginning, we are extremely aggressive people. I myself have a very sharp tongue that I'm constantly having to keep under control. We women, we're not, men particularly like fighting, a lot of them. I've been talking to a lot of war correspondents, and they tell me, you've no idea the adrenaline rush you get there. There's nothing like it. I can't imagine it myself, but that I'm not a man. But I have a sharp tongue instead. So we are aggressive people, and religious people do, as we know, commit horrific acts. But we mustn't forget that in our civilian nationalistic wars, the high numbers of casualties that have been killed, and they must be honoured too. This is an unacceptable statistic. We seem to have laid all the violent sins of the 20th century and the 21st century onto the back of religion and pushed it out of the political spectrum, sent it into the political wilderness. I think that what can we do about this? I think we can do only what the Buddhists, what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did, what Jesus did, is to create a vibrant, compassionate, just alternative. Something that models, and can model in a way that is accessible, just as it was in the Buddha's time. But we must also open our hearts to the pain of the world. Religion pushes you to open your hearts to the world's pain. All the great world religions put suffering, human suffering, right at the top of their agenda, and tell you that it's your duty to deal with it. There's a story about the Buddha that I think applies to all of us. It's a story that was told not as a historical fact, but as a story that tells people what they must do to achieve their own enlightenment. It said that when the Buddha was born, his father asked the local priests to come and tell the child's fortune. One of them said, this child will one day see 4 very disturbing things, and that will make him abandon the world and become a monk and seek to find, and he'll become a Buddha, an enlightened one, will preach a message of salvation to the world. Well, the Buddha's father was not really happy about this career option for his son. He had more ambitious, worldly ambitions. So he shut this child up, and this young man up, in a beautiful palace, and with beautiful grounds, a pleasure palace. And all around the grounds he planted guards to keep away any disturbing sight. Buddhism is a very psychological religion. And I think this is a wonderful image, the image of the guarded pleasure palace is a wonderful image of the mind in denial. We all want to think of suffering happening up in other places. And here in the United States, and in Europe too, we live in a pleasure palace. I mean, it has its moments, I agree, but we live in a pleasure palace. When we see suffering, like we saw from the Philippines, or what we're seeing from Syria, we are deluged with images of pain, and we want to keep it away from us somehow. But it's no good trying to shut this pain out, because pain always comes in. The one thing that we all have in common is pain and suffering. And one day the gods decided he's been living in this fool's paradise long enough, this young man. So they sent 4 gods down, disguised as a rich man, as a sick man, a corpse, an old man, and a monk. And the Buddha, who'd never seen any suffering before, was so shocked that night he left home, put on the yellow robe, and spent the next 40 years of his life trying to heal the suffering of the world, letting that pain invade your life and upset you. And I think we have a spiritual opportunity every time we turn on the news and see images of pain from around the world, or we hear that there's been another suicide bombing, and think of those families and of those lives cut off. Let this disturb us and break up our hearts, and then try and do something about it. That, I think, is the task. When the Buddha achieved enlightenment, it's said too that he was sitting under his tree, and he thought enjoying this wonderful, sacred, transcendent peace. And the inconvenient thought occurred to him that perhaps he should teach this message to help other people. And he thought, no, I don't want to do that. No one wants to give up their ego. It would just be very dispiriting and disappointing to me to do that. So I'm not going to do it. At this point, God, Brahma, the highest God, gave a terrible cry. And he said, then the world is lost. And he came down from heaven and knelt in front of the enlightened man. God kneels to the enlightened man. And he said, please look at the world. And the Buddha looked at the world and he saw the pain. And he spent the next 40 years of his life tramping around India to help people to deal with their suffering. And Jesus did the same. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, used to sat for a long time on Mount Hira at Ramadan, worrying about the plight of the political situation in Mecca, the social malaise, the injustice, wondering, racking his brains, we're told, to find a solution until the Quran came to him. And then he didn't sit on the mountaintop. He went down into Mecca and started to work hard and endured great pain and opposition. And his life was in danger frequently to try to build that more just and decent society. And we're told in Syria that when the revelations came to him, he would often sweat, even on a very cold day, sweat with the effort, or grow very pale and shake with the effort of speaking the word of God. And I think that's something that we can take to heart, because there are many people who go around saying what God wills in a very easygoing way, but that it's very difficult to find God's word and message and to speak it in a world filled with violence and cruelty and pain. And we all have the duty in our own way to sweat with the effort of trying to find a way to create a more just world. Same with Jesus, who ended up crucified in an attempt to build an alternative society. That it costs, but this is what our religion is calling us to do. Is religion really violent? It can be, but remember also the violence of the state. Secularism has also been violent. And it's no good denying that and pushing all the sins of the secular state onto this poor scapegoat and driving it into the wilderness. We have to acknowledge that the modern world has been a violent place. That Muslims are not alone in resorting to violence. Our states do it every day. And so our task, I think, is to make sure by our dedicated, strong effort that we build a society, build an alternative, so people can see that there's another, more compassionate way to live. Thank you.
I know we have a very limited time for question and answer, but we said that we will engage you and have you to ask questions, and this is your alternative, or your opportunity to ask a question. Any questions?
Yes, there's one.
So my question is regarding alternative to this modern world. I don't think of countries like Scandinavia, Sweden, and stuff. That would be a good example of this alternative to a compassionate world.
I didn't hear that.
So what would be a good example in the modern day world of countries that may have this kind of a model where they're not extremely nationalistic or going after these resources? Because I can think of countries like Scandinavia, and you can comment on that, please.
I don't think there are any states that are non-violent and entirely just. My own country certainly isn't. We've done a great deal of damage in the world, and I think most nations, most countries have to say the same. One example, I think, is South Africa. I'm thinking of Nelson Mandela and his witness. And I think things are not easy in South Africa today, but he showed an alternative way, not coming out of 27 years of prison with anger and desire to revenge and to oppress and to get back at the people who'd hurt him. And I think that moral leadership has helped South Africa, made a difference to the way South Africa's made that transition. It's still not easy in South Africa, but it would probably be an awful lot worse without him and Tutu, for example.
Dr. Karan, you will be happy to know that me and my wife, we are from the city of Ashoka in British India, Patna, and less than 100 miles of Buddha, where he got nirvana. I have two quick questions. As a Buddhist, why the Burmese Buddhists are killing those Rohingya Muslims that they are Muslim for more than 300 years? Second question is, I am from Karachi, Pakistan. Before Ziaul-Haq during the Reagan administration, Pakistan was a very modern country, very progressive country, everybody knows. Why is it happening right now that they are defending our good country like Pakistan?
Yeah, understand on that.
He said in Buddhism, he gave the example of Burma.
Yes.
And then in Pakistan, he said that
Why is there violence when it used to be a secular? Okay. Sorry, I didn't quite capture that. It was a kind of an echo. Thank you. First of all, these Buddhists, this is nationalism. It's done by, so it's not that they read the Buddhist texts and jump out and do this killing. And in the same way, Hamas is a nationalistic movement. It's for Palestine. And its violence when it was committing actions was as much for nationalistic regions as for religion. Again, the two were combined as in a cocktail, inseparable from one another. And if we're going to understand the violence of our time, we've got to take all elements into account and not just take up an easy option. Now, the other thing, Pakistan. I think there are, again, this is a complicated business. You're quite right that Pakistan was set up as a secular society, and Jinnah was an unavowed secularist. He was quite unabashed secularist. He just wanted to create a state where Muslims could exist without any kind of endlessly having to sort of defend themselves as they might have been in India. But here I have to say that the British have played a nefarious role, and the colonialists. When we set up Pakistan, it was the creation of Pakistan resulted in the trauma of partition, in which I think 7 million people were displaced and at least 1 million people died as they tried to move from India to Pakistan and back again. It was. And this was not a good, and if we'd been there, instead of having decamped the week before, we might have stopped some of that killing. Secondly, we British, we set up impossible boundaries for Pakistan. Kashmir, for example, which had a Muslim majority, but was given to India. And East Pakistan was separate from Western Pakistan. It was, and then say, create a nation state. Nationalism had no roots in the region in that way. So this is a difficult thing. Then there was the problem of the Deobandi people came. The Deobandi, when the British, this is a history lesson, if you did ask, when the British in 1857 disbanded the Mughal Empire and abolished it. The Muslims in India suddenly found themselves no longer in a position of power, but as a vulnerable minority. And it's a set of ulama in Deoband, near Delhi, I think, created a sort of sect where people, their ulama issued directives, fatwas, on governing every single aspect of life. So to enable Muslims to live a good Muslim life as a minority people, in a minority position. Well, it was a very hard ruled, sort of difficult, far too sort of stringent, an uncharacteristically stringent form of Islam. And they created these madrasas. Then comes the Afghan-Soviet war, and you have 3 million Afghan refugees, children, brought to traumatized children, put in these madrasas. and you have a mixture of Deobandi rigorism, war trauma, displacement, a community cut off from the rest of Pakistan, plus all the strains of constant warfare on that Afghan border. When I visited Pakistan, I met, the first time I was taken to see President Musharraf, who'd asked to see me. And he said, you've got to remember that Pakistan has been at war now for solidly 20 years. First with the Soviets, and then there was a glorious time when the Soviets went and the Americans went and everybody went, and then they're back again. And so it goes on. And warfare too creates a society of violence. There's all kinds of stuff about how Karachi became the gun capital of the world, which I won't go into now, but again, that was mismanagement and not... so you have the birth pangs of a nation are always difficult. In a place in Pakistan where it began with trauma, and it began with, and there's massive inequality there. You've got, and so many of the dispossessed peasants send their sons to these madrasas. They get a very, and they're aggressive because they've had a hard life. And that aggression has been channeled into a sectarian hatred. But, so you did ask for a history lesson, so I'm giving you.
We have right here.
We have
He was next, and then...
sisters. I have 5 daughters. I have to look to the ladies.
Well, I'm glad to hear what you mentioned, and I always believe the same thing, that the human beings are the one in trouble, are the one really troublemakers. Because I always believe that religion teaches peace, love each other. The problem is, religion is used for humans, and humans build churches, and churches used as a political issue in a way, because churches are sometimes political companies. I'm sorry to say that they manipulate to do something. A perfect example I would use is, for example, in Spain. Muslims were in Spain for over 700 years. Catholics, Muslims, and Jews live in peace and harmony most of the time. But after 1492, exactly the same year that Christopher Columbus came to America, the empire was unified after Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castilla get married and created the Inquisition, and they kill people in the name of God. They use God to kill people. But that's a real problem. So humans are a real problem, no religion, because religion is peace.
Yeah. Yes. In Britain at the moment, we have a commercial, and it goes like this. The commercial says, it shows, the weather doing unpredictable things. Mother's hanging up clothes on her clothesline, and suddenly there's a gust of wind and everything goes all over the place, or that kind of thing. And the commercial goes, the weather does lots of different things, and so does the post office. And then you have a sign of all the different things the post office does, except besides delivering letters. Now, in my book, I rephrased that, and I said, the weather does a lot of different things, but so does religion. Because religion's not all about one thing, because it was never one thing. It was always permeated with all of life. It was always intrinsically involved in politics, so therefore some of it's going to be violent. No religion becomes what we call a world religion unless it's had the patronage, unless it's been taken up by an expanding state or empire. Christianity became a world religion once it was taken up by the Roman Empire. Islam very quickly became an empire and spread throughout the world. And empires are violent. So there's going to be that aggression there. And also, but Spain, again, politics came into this too. And in the book, I found that every time there's persecution, as there suddenly was in Spain after years, centuries of convivencia, of living together, every time there's some persecution comes, it is because of often fear of an outside enemy. And that was absolutely the case in Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella came to power after a very, very divisive and bloody civil war. So the whole country is in turmoil. And two, the Ottomans were taking, a great naval campaign in the Mediterranean, going towards Spain. And in Granada, too, down in the south, they were helping the Ottomans. So you've got a country and embattled at war, and very often it seeks an enemy within. And that's the case, I think, with a lot of the sectarianism we see in the world today. It often occurs when there's an outside threat, when people feel threatened by an external power. It might be a colonial power, as it was with the British or the Americans, or a fear of American imperialism. A lot, I feel, of the persecution of Christians now in the Muslim world is due because it's linked somehow with Christianity is linked with Western imperialism in people's minds. So the political is always there too, as well as and all kinds of social factors go into this. It's never just a question of religion. Similarly, the Crusades, certainly they were manned by religious fervour, but the popes were using this politically to gain control of Europe. And by the end of the crusading period, it mattered more of the effect of the crusade at home than what actually happened in the Holy Land. It became entirely politicized by the end. At the same time, and this is an interesting thing that I found, we hear a lot about jihad and how jihad came up in the Muslim world. And a lot of the hadith about warfare is, these hadith developed and were collected during the conquest period and reflected very much the ideas of the troops. But by the time of the Crusades, that had gone. The Crusaders arrived in 1099, and they committed a most horrendous massacre in Jerusalem. The numbers, you can never be sure about the accuracy of numbers in the ancient world, but in the medieval world, before modern statistics came up. But it said they killed 30,000 people in Jerusalem in 2 days. Jews, Muslims, the place was drenched in blood. 5 months later, they still hadn't buried all the bodies. Now, after this horrendous beginning, and the Muslim chroniclers are bewildered, they'd never seen anything like it. They'd been fighting all the great powers in the region, but always within carefully prescribed limits. They were absolutely stunned by this. But interestingly, even though the Crusaders' ethos was very similar to the jihad ethos of the Hadith, with, you know how it says the jihad is the monasticism of Islam. They saw crusading as a form of monasticism for the laity. But the Muslims didn't recognize it as religious at all. They said, oh, they're just coming for politics and for money. And there was no move in the Muslim world to fight them. They settled down, they accepted the jihad spirit of God. They settled down and made treaties with the Crusaders. They fought with them sometimes, they intermarried with them, and it took Salah ad-Din, and before him Nuruddin, a great deal of effort to drum up that jihadi spirit again. And that jihadi spirit has never gone away, and it came into the Muslim world as the result of Western aggression. As a result of a concerted Western aggression. That's something for us to think about here. These things are much more complicated than is apparent on the surface. Actually, latest statistics on the Inquisition have said that far fewer Jews and Muslims were killed than was previously thought. Still too many, But it was not the great numbers that were thought as few as 10 years ago.
Thank you for coming. I truly enjoyed your talk. You were saying earlier that we shouldn't take the number of statistics lightly about death, like things that are going on around the world, and we should actively try to contribute to positive change. But how does an individual do that? Where do you start while still maintaining balance within your life? Because I find that whenever I get truly involved in these things, that I become so passionate and I just dive right into it, and then I look back and I'm like, okay, I'm getting too deep into this, you know, like I think I have a sharp tongue too, so I don't think that I could ever be part of politics, but I do want to actively struggle to positively change things around me. But where do you start? Thank you.
I think first of all you start with yourself. You start trying, instead of putting it's no good trying to put the world to rights when you yourself give way to anger and prejudice. The greater jihad. And Nuruddin and Saladin all said before they attacked the Crusaders, they had to have the greater jihad, the jihad to reform your own society, to reform your hearts. And they said that the first thing is to become a good Muslim. So, but we can't wait until we are perfect Muslims, or Christians or Jews, before we start to right the wrongs of the world. Otherwise, you know, it's a lifetime's work. We have to organize. It's not just a question of, we really have, I mentioned the example of the Prophet, peace be upon him, sweating with the effort of trying to find a way. Imam Majid here is sweating with the effort to find a way to make compassion for. He's one of the prime leaders of the Charters of Compassion with what he's doing, to find practical ways of making compassion a force. So I think we all have to do something we can in our own sphere. If something's happening in your mosque, or your join in with it and bring your contributions. It's not going to be an instant thing. It takes time. And we are so used to quick results and instant solutions and fast food, and you know, we don't wait for anything. We need, like the Prophet, peace be upon him, to sweat with the act. Real hard thinking, strategic, practical, realistic thinking. Because if you just do things in a moment of fervor, that burns out. And you get tired and you get dispirited. We need a sort of a dedicated commitment, practical. And you find out what's happening, what Imam Majid is doing. He is doing a great deal of things right here in ours. Join in with that. Bring what you can to that effort.
Thank you, Dr. Armstrong. I'm a great fan of yours, and I have one comment and a question.
Yeah.
My comment is also, I believe that religion in itself is not violent. Just, I like to give an example, like a gun, a bus, or a car. By itself, it doesn't do any harm. But when a person with good intention, he can use it for good, to transfer people, take people. He can also use it to harm people. So I believe that religion, any religion, is not violent. But the person, just like you have described, we had that. I'm sorry. My question to you, since you are from England and you are a historian, how can a small island like England, especially in the last 100 years, I really admire them. They did it very intelligently, but to this day, everywhere you go, the problem that they left, we couldn't solve it.
I quite agree with you, because I remember on 9/11, I was packing to come to the United States. And when I watched the towers fall, one of the things that went through my head was we helped to do this. We British helped to do this. And one of the reasons why I started, because my study of history has shown me, and we are, many of us are aware of this in Britain. There's a great sort of, post-colonial, look what we did. And this will happen in the United States too, when China has taken over. You're no longer a great world power. You'll start, it's easy, it's hard to think of that. Britain was a tiny country, but it achieved its power because it industrialized. It's pure, it's not any great spiritual, it simply was the first to find industrialization. That gave it an enormous economic and therefore military power, because industrialization produced industrialized warfare. And one of the things that I show in the book is that they created these terrible weapons. But at first, they wouldn't use them on Europeans. They would only use them in the colonies. And just using machine guns. And that element always comes into it too, the ethnic element. I think, you see, one of the reasons that things that disturbs me so much about the civilian casualties right now, when we sort of deplore, as we must deplore, suicide bombing that kills civilians, but we must also deplore the lives of all that are lost every day in Afghanistan and Iraq. And if we don't speak out, and there's no sustained outcry about these unacceptable casualties, it gives a very strong impression that the West thinks that some lives are more valuable than others. And that's something that we have to take into account. If we British had observed the golden rule in our colonies, and had treated the people in our colonies as we would wish to have been treated ourselves, we wouldn't be having so many problems today. That's absolutely right. But you see, they would say, they came in with their missionaries. Good priests and monks and nuns, who trailed in their wake, and, were supporting all this. So, again, religion, the weather does a lot of different things, but so does religion. You can, I'm sure they sincerely thought they were doing everybody a good turn in places like Egypt or Africa by telling them that their traditions were hopeless, or telling even other Christians that they weren't really Christians, they better become more Protestants. But this, again, they did, it's Jesus would have had a fit, I think, if he'd seen that. So I agree with you that Britain indeed has a lot to answer for. Any empire has done dreadful things. And the British Empire, the modern empires don't last as long as the older empires did. It was a very short-lived British Empire, really, in comparison. But it had the industry to do a great deal of harm.
Thank you. One final question.
Thank you, Dr. Armstrong, for your insight. I'm particularly impressed and appreciate your remarks about civilian casualties. And many people do not know the percentages that you mentioned. How would you recommend, or what is your advice about disseminating this information or getting the word out to the enormous harm done to innocent people?
Well, I've written a book. This is the end of the book, basically. This argument is there. Because this is, look what happened here in Washington just a couple of weeks ago. A Pakistani woman a year ago was killed by a drone missile when she was out picking vegetables. 65-year-old woman in front of her 9 grandchildren. She was killed, she was blown to pieces in front of them. And the children have had to have multiple surgery, some of them, and the younger ones still cry all night, utterly traumatized by it. And yet the United States has never either acknowledged this, and it's not offered compensation, or even told the American people what it's done. And her son came to Washington to speak to Congress about this, just if you remember, just a couple of weeks ago. Then, of course, it gets blown out of them because they killed the Taliban leader a couple of days later, and so, we don't dwell on that. But this is, part of the thing is that I think people can't bear to listen to this statistic. We have, and I write about this in the book, we have an inbuilt reluctance to kill other human beings. That's a survival mechanism, because it's not evolutionary smart to kill your own kind. It means the species won't survive. So that during World War II, they did surveys. There was an extraordinary survey done that showed only a tiny proportion of soldiers were able to shoot directly at people within range that they could see. The advantage of modern weaponry is that you can cut people down without they're distant and you're not seeing them. And they found that in World War II, that distancing effect was made possible by aerial bombardment. They found that the people who were in the high up aeroplanes dropping bombs were not nearly as worried about killing the people down below as the people in helicopters who could see their victims. Now the drone is the latest thing, where we just send it out, and you never see it, it's miles away. And I think it's denial. Think back to the Buddha's pleasure park, where you've got the guards all around the ground saying, keep pain at bay. We just need to get these, people don't know, but just think, every time you see there's a report of a suicide bombing, just think of that. Find out about the drones. I mean, it's all in the public domain, and find out about the civic. Don't just rely on Fox News and the media. It's there, and you need to say this to your congressman. This is how democracy works. You go to your congressman and say, what do we do about this? Otherwise, democracy simply becomes a rubber stamping machine. But also, I think, just to acquaint ourselves with what's going on and spare a thought for all the innocent people who are dying simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yes, and weep. We need to make people weep for what is happening. It's the only, so that they see that these are not just ciphers. These are people like that little family that were blown to pieces. And their pain, and as her son said, quite simply, frankly, no one seems to care. That's a stain on us all, and that's the sort of thing that, as a compassionate community, someone asked me once about, we're creating a network of cities of compassion. And I was doing a down the line thing to a conference, and one of them said, what should a compassionate city look like? And people were expecting it would be full of love and sweetness and people handing around plasma. It could be all those things, I agree, I'm not denouncing that. But I say it should be an uncomfortable city. There should be discomfort because you're not just thinking of creating a nice, cozy little community here, you're thinking globally about the pain in the world. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, I believe, said, not one of you can be a believer unless if he can sleep while he knows that somebody is hungry. And that's the religious spirit. To bear, it could only be in his day, the immediate ummah. Now we have the world media that tells us about, and we've created a community where we are all neighbours and brothers and sisters of one another. And we must try to cultivate that spirit so that we don't just think that, oh, they don't matter. We must try to show that they matter intensely.
Unfortunately, she has another engagement, am I correct? In Baltimore. Therefore, I really wanted to give you a chance and the young lady a chance, but you can approach maybe as she's leaving to ask a question. Would you mind to let go of the question? Because of the limited time that they have. I have very difficult listening to people know, as you can know from my way that I'm responding to you. But I'd like us to say that in the concluding remarks, really thank you very much for the great insight. We're looking forward for the book. I want to say that my own experience that I met a man from Iraq, American, who went to Iraq for missionary, and he decided to look to the issue of children being impacted by the war, and he created an organization called Preemptive Love. And we have hosted him at Adams here, helping the children of Iraq. And we have seen, how the war have impacted the children of Iraq. Until today, hundreds of children in Iraq being born with defects because of the war. And I have a lady from Iraq, a doctor who was a speaker at the Carter Center, spoke about that. Also, I have been in Ashford, and I went to saw the Holocaust site. And I can tell you that you said that people compute from distance. I've seen people taking people and burn them. And the children's shoes, and the clothes, and the suitcase has names of the family. We thought that they're going somewhere else, and they're being taken, they will ask to go to a shower, and they're being burned alive. Or let's give you an example of people being killed in Pakistan or Afghanistan and places like that. Or Bosnia, this is recent, or Rwanda, all of these places. And therefore, one of the things we're going to do is called Human Lives Tour, to see the pain of others so there'll be more compassion. I hope that her talk makes us uncomfortable sometimes, because that's what she is. She tries to make us uncomfortable so we do the right things. Our child of compassion would be a global movement, a turning point in human history, God willing. And I'm working with her closely, and then many people love to work with her. Thank you very much. I have a blessed night.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu